Hello, my name is Steve Lally and I'm a professional storyteller, and I have been part of a wonderful project called Museums Tell Stories. And I've been working in some of the museums in the north of Ireland. One of the museums I was working in was Enniskillen Castle, based in Enniskillen, County Fermanagh. So Enniskillen Castle is also a museum, and they have a fantastic collection of wonderful items from the past. But as we all know, Ireland has an interesting past, to say the least, and some of it is not also positive. And of course, one of the darkest stories from Ireland's past was the Great Famine. And one of the objects that I was shown in the museum is this here. I don't know if you can see that. It's a shoe. It's actually a child's shoe that was found inside a wall in the workhouse in Enniskillen. And of course, the workhouse was a terrible place. In fact, the workhouse was considered to be a fate worse than death. And people would rather actually die of starvation than go to the workhouse. They were specially designed that if you went there once, you never wanted to go back there again. That was the idea. Now, to avoid these sort of situations like workhouses and, of course, starvation, people had to work out a way to generate some sort of a living. And one of the most common ones was the spalpeen, or the hired worker. And these were young men, young women who would hire themselves out to wealthier people, wealthy farmers in the big houses, to do work. They would go to hiring fairs, and they would also just go from house to house, knocking on doors to ask, did they need some work in return for some food or a bit of accommodation. What's very interesting about these spalpeens, though, is that they were great storytellers, okay? Because they traveled all over the country and they went from town to town and townland to townland, or to say, hock a chock. And the more stories these spalpeens had, the more work they got, because at the time, the storyteller was really the modern television, I suppose, or radio. And our story is about a spalpeen who was from a place called Derrylin in County Fermanagh. And he was a great worker, but there was a bit of a problem with him. He didn't have any stories, not one. And as a result, he found it very hard to get work. He'd knock on somebody's door and they'd say, Tom, that was his name. Tom, not today. There's a wee woman coming down the road after you, and she's a great storyteller. We're going to hire her instead. So poor Tom, as a result, found it harder and harder to get work. And it wasn't long before he found himself destitute. So one day he was walking through some class of a field, and he thought to himself, surely to goodness things cannot get any worse. Well, believe me, when you get to my vintage, you'll find out that things can and do and will get worse every so often. Because as soon as he said that, the heavens opened up and the rain came down about him. But he persevered and he kept going. And as he kept walking, he could see a little light in the distance, and he walked closer to the light until he realized there was a tilly lamp in the window of a little cottage. He thought to himself, surely whoever is inside this house will let me out of the rain and give me a bit of shelter, and I hope they don't ask me to tell them a story. So he went to the house and he lifted up his fist and he was just about to knock on the half door when the door opened. And there, standing in the doorway, was a man, a tall, thin man, dressed from head to toe in black. He had long black hair and a long black beard. He looked like a cross between Count Dracula and Rasputin. He looked at the wee man standing there and he says, hello, Tom. I've been expecting you. Tom thought this was very strange. He'd never met this man in his life. The man says, come in out of that rain, Tom. So Tom came in and the house was lovely and warm. There's a big raging fire with a pot hanging off the crook and something only divine bubbling away inside it. And the smell was so good the teeth were swimming in his mouth. The man says, Tom, are you hungry? And Tom says, I'm starving. He says, sit down there now. And he sat down on front of a wee table. The man waved his hand over the table and a big bowl of stew and some lovely wheaten bread and a slap of butter and a cup of buttermilk appeared, and he ate the whole lot down, and it was delicious. He'd never had food as good in all his days. The man says, Tom, are you tired? Tom says, I'm exhausted. He says, behind that door there, you'll find yourself a wee room. And sure enough, Tom got up, he opened the door, and behind that door there was a room. And in that room there was a little settle bed. And he lay down the little settle bed with the fresh linen sheets and the lovely warm woolen blankets and the feathered pillows. Oh my goodness. Sure, poor Tom was used to sleeping out hay barns, and getting the only bit of warmth he has was whatever livestock was sleeping there with him. Anyway, sure, as soon as his head hit the pillow, he fell fast asleep. But during the night, he was woken up by something pulling his hair and something poking him in the eye. He looked up and he saw three little creatures looking down at him, one stranger looking than the other, and they were all going, come on, Tom, get out of bed, Tom, you're a lazy buns, Tom, no time like the present, Tom. And they grabbed Tom out of the bed and he fell onto the ground. As soon as he hit the ground, he saw there was a big coffin on the ground beside him. The little men poked and prodded him and said, come on now, Tom, carry the coffin, Tom. Who's going to carry the coffin? And they all shouted, Tom will, Tom will. And with that, they threw the coffin up on his back and they lifted him up and they pushed him out through the house, out through the front door, into the raging storm, and they took him to a graveyard where there was a big wall around it. They made Tom lift the coffin over the graveyard and climb over the wall behind it. As soon as he did this, the three little men walked a couple of yards this way and opened a gate and walked inside. And they took Tom to a plot where there was a shovel sticking out of the ground, and they shouted, who will dig the grave? Tom will, Tom will. Come on now, Tom, dig a grave, dig a hole, Tom, come on. And Tom dug and dug and dug and dug until eventually he found himself inside a big hole. And then one of the wee men pulled him out by the hair of the head, and they all started getting very excited, nudging each other, laughing, tithering and giggling. And one of them says, who will go inside the coffin? Tom will, Tom will. They lifted up Tom, they threw him inside the coffin, they put the lid on it, and Tom was trapped inside. He could hear the nails being hammered in, tap, 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 tap. Well, he heard the muffled voices outside. Who will go inside the grave? Tom will, Tom will. He felt the coffin being lifted up and boom, down into the hole he went. Then he heard the sound of the earth being shoveled on top of the lid of the coffin. He was trapped inside, fighting with the lining, saying, help, help, somebody help me, I'll do anything, I'll even learn a story. And with that, Tom was fighting with the lining of the coffin when all of a sudden he found himself fighting with the sheets of the bed. Thank goodness it was all just a bad dream. But Tom lifted off the sheets of the bed. He was still wearing his clothes and his boots were still on. They were covered in mud. Very strange. Most peculiar. So he got up and he walked into the main room where the tall man dressed in black was sitting there. And he says, Tom, did you sleep well last night? And Tom says, I didn't really. Oh, that's a terror, Tom, that's a terror. Do you have a story to tell though? And Tom says, you know, funny enough, I do. Well, and he started to tell the story about the three little men that appeared. But before he had a chance to get into it, the tall man stood up and took a deep breath, and he says, who will tell us a story? And with that, the three little demons came flying down the chimney and they said, Tom will, tell us a story, Tom, anything at all, Tom. We love stories. Three little pigs, Goldilocks, anything at all. Little Red Riding Hood, what have you got for us? They jumped on his shoulders and he ran out through the door. He thought he was a goner. When he hit the ground, the three little men disappeared. And when he looked over his shoulder, the little house had disappeared too. And all that was left behind was a ball of mist. But let me tell you something. From that day onwards, Tom the Spalpeen was never, ever, ever out of work. Everybody wanted to hire him because Tom had the best story that anyone had ever heard. And maybe, just maybe, this shoe may have belonged to Tom. Ha ha!